A raw lamb's head was placed in front of the man, then the chef asked the man to take the lamb's tongue.
Ăn cái này là bà im miệng lại hả?
Một miếng cậu ăn, cậu sẽ nếm được một nỗi đau của mẹ mình. Nếu như cậu nuốt được nỗi đau đó, thì ước mơ sẽ trở thành sự thật.
But the chef added, to fulfill a wish, you must pay an expensive price. The man immediately ate the roasted tongue. Unexpectedly, his mother's tongue was suddenly cut into several pieces. Now she could no longer nag her son. How could this not be considered fulfilling a wish? And this mysterious little restaurant was actually collecting souls for the demon. The chef was the demon's agent. A few days ago, the man named John was originally just an ordinary mechanic. He and his wife were very loving. But one day 3 months ago, his fate was suddenly changed. That day, his wife went out as usual but unexpectedly had a car accident, resulting in the loss of their unborn child. John was in immense pain over this. Even worse, the doctor told John that due to the accident, his wife would no longer be able to conceive. If they wanted to have children in the future, they could only do so through in vitro fertilization. But the high costs left John feeling deeply powerless. Additionally, with his wife's injuries, even if John sold their house, it would be of no use. Heartbroken, he went to the restaurant to drink, where he met the owner, George. George noticed that John was troubled and asked him what was wrong. John had nothing to hide and immediately explained his current situation. After listening, George took out a mysterious wooden box and told John that this thing could help him change his fate. Seeing it was just a wooden box, John didn't pay much attention to it.
Cái hộp gỗ này nó sẽ giúp tôi kiếm được tiền hả?
His joking words were taken seriously by George, who affirmed them. This made John's heart race. Then, George grabbed John's hand and pricked one of his fingers. With John's approval, he pressed the finger into the box. In the next moment, John felt as if something was sucking on his finger. George said that this was a normal phenomenon. Even with his assurance, John still felt extremely terrified by this bizarre situation. Soon afterward, the sucking sensation from the box ceased. George asked John to take out his finger while he tightly closed the box. Moments later, when George opened the box again, it was filled with cash. This miraculous scene instantly aroused John's interest. Seeing that his prey had taken the bait, George told John that he could trade the box to him. John couldn't believe it was real, but upon learning that he had to pay with his soul, he hesitated slightly. Handing over his soul might lead to a terrible fate, but if he didn't get this box, he would soon face ruin. In the end, he signed the demonic contract with George. This contract was very special. It was actually a dish. According to George, as long as he ate it, he would own the mysterious box. He would gain immense wealth through blood, until John could no longer nourish it with blood. During this time, all the souls that died because of the box would belong to George. In order to obtain this mysterious box, John forced himself to eat despite feeling nauseous. As they were about to part, George suddenly said something baffling.
Cậu có chắc tiền chính là con đường dẫn đến hạnh phúc của mình chưa?
At this moment, John believed it firmly. From that point on, he completely changed his fate. Wealth allowed John to save his wife, and through in vitro fertilization, his wife became pregnant again. But as time passed, nourishing the box became a major issue. John looked at his finger, covered in wounds, but could only endure the pain. To nourish the mysterious box as agreed, he couldn't help but have some other thoughts. John wanted to gain sustainable wealth through investments, thus abandoning the need to nourish the box. So, he contacted a local businessman through his friend Charlie, hoping to collaborate with him. For this reason, John entrusted almost all his wealth to this person. Before long, John learned that the businessman he had hired had been arrested and imprisoned. That investment was about to go to waste. At this point, he was extremely anxious. Fortunately, Charlie told John that as long as he paid a hefty bail, he could get the businessman out. This way, his previous investment wouldn't be in vain. Although John had already given all his wealth to the businessman, he felt that he owned the mysterious box and thus didn't take it to heart. He immediately rushed back home to nourish the box with his blood. John was horrified to discover that the box no longer sucked his blood. Naturally, no cash appeared, John was in a panic, not knowing what was wrong, and could only keep filling the box with blood, hoping it would save him. However, until the box was nearly full of blood, it still showed no reaction. John recalled George's earlier words and realized he was about to lose the box. Just then, his friend Charlie suddenly arrived. He somehow learned about the mysterious box, and wanted to take it up. The two got into a heated argument. At this moment, an accident occurred. As they fought over the box, Charlie seemed to experience some extreme pain, while John felt nothing. He realized that the box was craving Charlie's blood, so he immediately stabbed Charlie to death. Then John used Charlie's blood, and indeed received a response from the box. A large amount of cash surged forth from the box. As John reveled in his joy, his pregnant wife happened to witness the scene. Seeing the blood-soaked floor and cash, his wife immediately realized that her husband was committing murder for money. She tried to stop John and seized the box from him, but John seemed to have completely lost his mind and even killed his wife. By the time he realized it, it was too late. His wife and their unborn child passed away. He looked at the photos on his wife's phone. After a moment of hesitation, he finally chose to end his own life. Meanwhile, George in the bar watched as the lights before him lit up one by one, knowing it was related to John. As the fourth light was lit, George's expression became extremely excited. He hurriedly rushed towards the bar's exit, but before he could get out, the door suddenly closed. Immediately afterward, several empty light bulbs appeared in front of the bar, seemingly waiting for new souls to lighten them. George immediately lost control of his emotions and yelled at a wooden carved door in the bar. It seemed that everything that had just happened was controlled by that thing. Bound by the demon's wooden carving in the restaurant, he could only stay here to hunt souls. Soon, a new target came to him willingly. Seeing the other person's gloomy expression, George was very sure that this guy would take the bait. Taking advantage of the man's drinking, George asked the man what had happened. This was how he learned that the man was named Brown and was originally the top sales performer at his company. He was highly valued by his boss. However, not long ago at the company annual meeting, Brown's mother had a huge argument with the boss. She believed that her son provided the company with numerous orders every year, and the boss made an endless fortune, yet never awarded her son a bonus. Instead, he only handed out a few worthless glass trophies. Brown knew his mother meant well, but in that situation, he felt more embarrassed. His mother was angry at Brown's weakness and stormed out. However, this was just the beginning of Brown's misfortunes. To make his mother happy and to gain her approval, Brown brought his girlfriend home. His mother immediately declared she would never allow him to marry her. Hearing his mother's resolute attitude, his girlfriend turned and left. Brown thought that his mother disliked his girlfriend's status. After all, she worked at a foot massage center. But later he learned that his mother didn't dislike her status, but rather her personality. His mother said Brown's girlfriend was too dominant, and if they married, Brown would only be suppressed. His mother constantly used her own experiences as examples to advise Brown to be more assertive, whether dealing with the boss or the girlfriend. It seemed to validate his mother's words. Then, the boss called, claiming to be inspired by his mother and prepared to award Brown a hefty bonus. Hearing this news, Brown was overjoyed. He hurried to the company, but upon arrival, he found that the boss wasn't going to give him a bonus at all. Instead, in front of everyone, he announced Brown's dismissal. Brown realized this was all caused by his mother. He couldn't help feeling some resentment. Brown planned to pour all this out to his girlfriend, but was once again told that their relationship was completely over, which made Brown even more resentful towards his mother. He didn't want to go home and could only come to the restaurant. After listening to Brown's story, George casually suggested,
Ở nhà không có băng keo hả? Hay là cắt lưới luôn?
Although Brown verbally denied it, the smile on his face betrayed his true feelings. To help Brown better release his true self, George took out a lamb's head and told him to imagine that this was his mother. Then he used a knife to cut off the lamb's tongue. At first, Brown was a bit resistant, but under George's provocation, Brown became angrier. In the end, he vented all his resentment on the lamb. He successfully crossed that psychological barrier. After this release, Brown felt much more at ease. he prepared to go back and explain the situation to his mother, hoping she would no longer interfere in his life. However, his dominant mother not only rejected Brown's proposal on the spot but also kicked him out of the house. Brown's heart, which had finally calmed down, was once again filled with various resentments. Seeing Brown return, George already understood his thoughts. This time he presented the real terms of the deal, which was to help Brown get rid of his mother's nagging. As a price, all the souls lost would belong to George. Brown was already fed up with his mother, so he decisively agreed to George's deal. Soon, George prepared a special roasted lamb tongue. As long as Brown ate it completely, his mother would be silenced forever. If he paused midway, his soul would be collected on the spot. Without any hesitation, Brown cut off a piece of the lamb tongue and stuffed it into his mouth. In the next second, he found himself beside his girlfriend. Brown looked at the strange man next to her and hurriedly approached, pleading to reconcile, only to be pushed away by her. It was then that Brown saw in the mirror that he had taken on his mother's appearance. Immediately afterward, Brown found himself back in the restaurant. George told him that the previous scene was his mother's memory. To end the pain his mother brought him, he must endure the pain his mother had suffered for him. Brown learned that his mother had gone to see his girlfriend and had been humiliated by her. He began to hesitate about whether to eat a second piece of lamb tongue. In the end, Brown didn't stop. This time, he found himself in the boss's office. He learned that his mother had secretly gone to plead with the boss for him, hoping to restore her son's position, but was humiliated and shoved by him. It was then that Brown began to understand his mother's struggles. He became even more hesitant about whether to give up. But at this moment, George suddenly said that
Chuyện cuối cùng là chuyện do cha cậu gây.
Brown had never seen his father. His heart was filled with curiosity. After a difficult decision, he decided to eat the lamb's tongue. This time, Brown saw a scene from many years ago. At that time, he was a baby, running a high fever. His mother wanted to take him to the hospital, but his father was drunkenly obstructing her. In the end, his mother burst through the door, causing his father to fall down the stairs and die on the spot. Knowing all this, Brown fell silent. He hurried back home, only to find bloodstains everywhere. Brown vaguely sensed that something was wrong. When he found his mother, he discovered that her tongue had already been cut out. Brown was filled with regret over his actions. He wanted to take his mother to the hospital, but Brown didn't know that in his mother's eyes, he had already become the image of his deceased father. His mother fought back desperately, and in the end, Brown was pushed down the stairs and died. At the same time, George's side added another green light. At the same time, a similar tragedy occurred at a nearby school. Stephen listened in disbelief to the news from the school. He couldn't understand why his son suddenly fell from the building. Through the surveillance footage released by the school, Stephen discovered that his son, before the accident, seemed to be chased by someone. He could only hide everywhere. He concluded that his son had been pushed down and killed. However, the teacher said that the footage didn't capture any relevant content. Stephen was filled with frustration over this. Just as he was thinking about how to find out the cause of his son's death, a student approached Stephen. Stephen immediately realized that the student definitely knew some inside information. Before he could even ask, the student hurriedly fled. It seemed he was also in some kind of danger. Stephen was unwilling to let the clue break off like this. Therefore, he immediately chased in the direction the student had left. He then saw several thugs beating up the student. Stephen saved him, but no matter how he asked, the student refused to disclose any further information. With no other options, Stephen had to follow the student's suggestion to find a student named James. He learned about James's appearance from photos in his son's room. While searching, he happened to pass by a restaurant and went in to find something to fill his stomach. George habitually asked and learned that Stephen also harbored hatred. He immediately decided to hook Stephen in. George purposely started talking about the difficulties of revenge, saying he had a way to help Stephen take revenge more discreetly. Upon hearing this news, Stephen became fully focused. Then, George took out a camera and casually took a photo of Stephen's hand. After that, he inserted a pair of tweezers into the photo. Suddenly, Stephen felt a sharp pain in his palm. When George pulled out the tweezers, the photo surprisingly gushed out bright red blood, and Stephen's own hand also bled constantly. Clearly, this was what George referred to as a more discreet method of revenge. However, Stephen thought that this method was too cruel for him to accept. Thus, George said no more. Only when Stephen was about to leave did he give him a piece of advice.
Nếu vậy thì về thắp nhang cho con của ông. Tớ nói rằng ông không muốn trả thù.
Which was like a nail that pierced into Stephen's heart. Not long after, he found James. Just as he was about to ask about his son's death, he was pinned to the ground and beaten by several people. It turned out that James's father was a member of the school board. They threatened Stephen that he was not allowed to approach James in the future, or else they would make him suffer. At this moment, Stephen understood the difficulty of revenge. He also realized that only relying on his own strength, he couldn't avenge his son at all. Combined with the provocation of George's earlier words, he had to return to the restaurant again. George understood Stephen's intentions and immediately prepared a dish for him. As long as Stephen ate it, it would signify his agreement to the deal with the demon. He would get the mysterious camera with powers. However, the souls lost as a result would all belong to George. In order to avenge his son, Stephen decisively ate the strange food. After that, he took the camera and once again searched for James's whereabouts. Not long after, he successfully pinpointed James's location. Upon seeing Stephen appear, James turned and ran away. Stephen took a photo immediately and folded it in half. In the next second, James's legs were severely injured, rendering him unable to run anymore. Stephen caught up to James and pressed him for the cause of his son's death. James initially wanted to conceal the truth. Stephen used the camera again. This time, he severely injured James's arm. Feeling the excruciating pain, James finally revealed the truth. It turned out that Stephen's son and James were lovers. Not long ago, Stephen's son wanted to announce their relationship. James didn't want his family to know about this, so he arranged for someone to take the evidence from Stephen's son. An accident occurred during this, which led to Stephen's son falling. Hearing the truth was like this, Stephen felt a mix of emotions in his heart. What's more troubling, James had died from his severe injuries due to the earlier interrogation. Stephen decided to seek George's help but was immediately refused. After all, according to the agreement, James's soul already belonged to him. Stephen immediately took out the camera and threatened George to release James's soul at once. However, George showed no fear on his face. Stephen instantly took a photo. In the next second, George surprisingly pierced the photo with a knife. Stephen discovered that the person in the photo was actually himself in the mirror. As George pulled out the knife, blood gushed from Stephen's neck. In the end, he also became a green light in the restaurant. Not long after, another person arrived at the restaurant. He was a somewhat scruffy middle-aged man. From his account, George learned that Bob had just committed a robbery. He had to come in to hide. Upon hearing this, George had already made up his mind. He wanted to turn the man into a light here. However, as he learned more, he found that things weren't as he had expected. Bob claimed that today was his birthday. The robbery was merely an act of revenge against the injustice of fate. He continuously talked about the hardships he had faced over the years. Bob said that when he was very young, his mother died in a car accident. At that time, he had no means to support himself and could only wander aimlessly to survive. This led him to live in a daze every day, and he developed bad habits. After finally growing up a bit, he was suppressed daily by unscrupulous bosses. Bob was very angry because of this. One day during work, his bad habits suddenly flared up, accidentally kicking over a nearby brick, almost hitting the boss below. As a result, he was fired on the spot. Bob remembered very clearly that when he left, his co-workers kept mocking him. Bob believed his life had been ruined by that car accident. Thus, Bob decided to take revenge on society. Coincidentally, on his birthday, he saw a girl stumbling in front of him. Seeing that no one was around, he robbed the girl's wallet and hid in the restaurant, only to find it was empty. After hearing Bob's story, George felt a bit of sympathy for the man in front of him.
Nếu mẹ không chết, mày có khác không?
Khác hoàn toàn.
so George decided to help him. He took out a glass jar filled with many pickled currants. Bob merely glanced at it, and suddenly, the image of his mother appeared in his mind. George told Bob that as long as he licked it, he could go back to the past. Bob, half believing, licked it. Sure enough, when he opened his eyes again, he found himself back in that alley. He looked at the girl, without any hesitation, and robbed her wallet again. What happened next was exactly the same as before. Bob ran back to the restaurant and saw George again. He was astonished by this magical ability. He pleaded with George to let him go back in time to save his mother and change his current life. George immediately presented a dish. It was made from the same type of currants. There were 3 currants on top. George said that for each one he ate, he could go back to the past once. However, it would also deduct 10 years from his life. Once all 3 were eaten, Bob would immediately die. Hearing this, Bob hesitated for a moment, but thinking about his current life, he decided to change the past. Bob picked up a currant without hesitation and ate it. Sure enough, the next moment, he found himself back years ago. However, Bob was unprepared for his first journey back. He could only watch helplessly as the accident happened again. In the days that followed, it was almost identical to his past life. He wasted his time and developed bad habits. During this time, Bob had thought about changing, such as preventing the brick from falling to avoid being fired, but he simply couldn't control his body. In the end, he was still fired by his boss for various reasons. He returned to the path of robbery again. However, this time, he chose to rob the girl's phone instead of the empty wallet. When George saw Bob again, he could tell by his look that he had failed. But Bob still had a chance. As the second currant was eaten, Bob returned to the past once more. Thinking about all the experiences he had, he believed that to avoid death, he needed to steer clear of those puddles. Although he tried very hard, he still couldn't change his mother's fate. However, the subsequent events had some slight changes. Bob no longer wasted his time like that, so he didn't develop bad habits. Like the butterfly effect, his world underwent a huge transformation. In this life, his boss valued him greatly and frequently awarded him bonuses. However, Bob still couldn't let go of his feelings. He looked at his mother's portrait and pondered for a long time. Finally, he decided to start over once more. So, he returned to that restaurant and saw George again. Seeing Bob's completely different spirit, George knew that he had successfully changed himself. When he heard that Bob wanted to start over again, George advised him to stop. However, what supported Bob at this point was no longer material conditions but the obsession he had always held. George's persuasion was in vain, and he could only let Bob eat the third currant. Immediately after, a green light in the restaurant was lit. Clearly, Bob had died. George was filled with emotions and raised a glass to the portrait beside him. Inside was his father, who had died many years ago. Clearly, it was this emotional connection that made him offer Bob so much help. But George's actions attracted the displeasure of the restaurant's demons. In the next second, he heard a harsh sound coming from the wooden carving. George felt a splitting headache. This pain lasted for an unknown amount of time. When he regained his senses, his eyes were already filled with blood. Then, the story in the restaurant continued. However, this time, the customers were no longer an individual but a couple. Leo and Vito had fallen in love quickly, despite knowing each other for a short time. Before long, they moved in together. However, the good times didn't last long. One day, while Vito was tidying up the room, she suddenly found a woman's underwear in the closet. She suspected that Leo had betrayed their relationship, so immediately chose to leave home. When Leo returned, he didn't understand what had happened. He could only go to Vito's workplace to find out why she had left, only to see his girlfriend kissing another man. Leo thought Vito had found a new love and left him. He left the bar in a daze, but didn't notice that Vito slapped the customer who had forcefully kissed her and even used a knife to make that customer back off. Thus, a deep rift formed between Leo and Vito. Lost in thought, Leo arrived at George's restaurant. Seeing the young man drinking alone, George immediately sensed that this man had a secret. He was very suitable to be his customer, so, under George's suggestion, Leo shared the story of himself and Vito. After listening, George felt some sympathy. he had no intention of hurting Leo. Instead, he suggested that Leo communicate honestly with Vito to resolve the misunderstandings between them. Leo felt annoyed, however, he turned and left the restaurant, fueled by alcohol. Leo became increasingly angry. Finally, he threw away their promise bracelet carelessly by the roadside. Unexpectedly, it hit a homeless man. The man cursed Leo for carelessly throwing trash. However, Leo clearly didn't care about his words. Not long after, Leo returned home to find that Vito had come back. Before he could say anything, Vito asked first, asking Leo to explain the woman's underwear in the closet. Leo was instantly stunned by these words. When he saw the underwear in the closet, Leo himself didn't understand where this thing came from. Fueled by alcohol, Leo immediately said that Vito was also unfaithful to him. He then described everything he saw outside the bar. Vito patiently explained what had happened, but Leo only wanted to believe what he had seen. Seeing she couldn't convince her boyfriend, Vito didn't know what to do inside. At this moment, she discovered that her boyfriend's promise bracelet was missing. Putting together his previous actions, Vito was completely disappointed. She decisively packed her things and moved out. Their relationship was completely shattered. Leo wanted to stop Vito, but before he could act, a violent cough left Leo no time to think about anything else. After the coughing fit, he was horrified to find that he had coughed up a piece of flesh. Leo immediately realized that there seemed to be a serious problem with his body. Meanwhile, Vito was increasingly angry that Leo didn't come to find her. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She finally decided to break off the relationship. Thus, Vito also threw the promise bracelet by the roadside, only to hit the same homeless man. Clearly, their fate was not yet over. Disappointed, Vito arrived at George's restaurant as well. After a discussion, George said he could prepare a dish to help Vito completely forget her partner. In exchange, Vito's soul after her death would belong to George. After a brief hesitation, Vito agreed. Not long after that, Leo also came to George's restaurant. Learning that George could help erase memories, Leo begged George for help. He wasn't heartless. He had learned that his days were numbered. After that day, Leo went to the hospital for a checkup and found out that there was a problem with his heart. If he couldn't undergo an expensive heart transplant, he would die soon. But he simply couldn't let go of Vito, so he could only ask George for help. Shortly after, a special porridge was placed in front of Leo, similar to Vito's request. Once Leo died, his soul would belong to George. Leo didn't hesitate and began to eat the porridge. The next moment, the memories of Vito began to disappear like bubbles. Moments later, Leo had completely forgotten Vito. He left the restaurant heavily, but just as he got halfway, his condition suddenly worsened again. Not only did he vomit the porridge he had just eaten, but he also coughed up another piece of flesh. If Leo had followed his original plan, he would leave this world alone. However, fate had other plans. He unexpectedly spent his final days in George's restaurant and encountered Vito once again. The two fell in love at first sight once more. Seeing this situation, George said nothing more. Just let them touch the demon carving together. In the next moment, the two remembered everything they had been through. They understood each other's feelings. However, Leo had little time left. They spent their final moments together. A few days later, both of their green lights were lit simultaneously. George felt a surge of emotions in his heart and couldn't help but reflect on his own life. From the time he could remember, he had been working with his father to create a massive wooden sculpture. Young George asked many times about the purpose of the sculpture but was only told that it was custom-made for a restaurant owner. Father and son spent decades finally completing the enormous sculpture. It was a grotesque image of a demon, but underneath it contained a disc, symbolizing the 6 realms of reincarnation. George and his father had worked hard to finally finish it. They immediately sought out the restaurant owner to receive their payment. To their surprise, he had no intention of giving them a single penny. The owner claimed that all of this was a debt that George's father owed him and said that the debt was far from settled. George thought he was just trying to evade his responsibilities. After they left, George's father suddenly fell gravely ill. Soon after, he would leave this world for good. Faced with the need to make a living, George had to approach the restaurant owner again. hoping that he could provide some money to help his father. But the restaurant owner told him that his father had already accrued this huge debt before he was born. George didn't understand what kind of debt it was that hadn't been settled even after more than 40 years. But the owner said something that shocked him.
Dám làm gì?
Giết tao.
George thought the other party was joking. In the next moment, the restaurant owner slashed his own arm with a knife. George thought he had gone mad, then hurried to bandage the restaurant owner's arm. The next second, the restaurant owner's arm miraculously healed, showing no signs of injury at all. Such a bizarre occurrence completely shocked George. Then, he learned from the restaurant owner the entire story of his father's debt. Many years ago, his father was at a low point in his life. Even mere survival became a challenge. At this time, he came to the restaurant. After learning of the owner's special abilities, he made a deal with the demon. From that point on, George's father gained extraordinary carving talent, with the price being that he had to kill the restaurant owner. He would then take his place, remaining in the restaurant forever. George knew the outcome that followed. His father had a change of heart, not wanting to kill the restaurant owner to take his place, but instead, he planned to carve a magical sculpture to repay the debt, which would provide a new opportunity to leave. Clearly, this wouldn't satisfy the restaurant owner, which is why he had previously announced that George's father hadn't fully repaid the debt. Upon hearing this, George couldn't help but wonder, did the owner only find release through death? In response to his confusion, the owner patiently explained, in fact, there are 3 ways to leave the restaurant. There are a total of 3 methods. The first is to directly open the wooden door next to it. That way, one could leave directly. However, to open that door, one must be a person without sin and perfect. How could such a person possibly exist in the world? Thus, theoretically, only 2 methods remain. The second is also a complete trap. The demon demands that as long as all green lights are lit, one can leave this place. However, after every complete lighting, new green lights will emerge, never allowing one to reach the true end. This leaves only the last method, which is to have someone kill oneself. Now, George's father's serious illness is a result of his attempt to defy the contract. As the saying goes, debts must be repaid by the children. The owner proposed that if George killed himself, it would spare his father from suffering. George hesitated for a long time and still refused. Finally, at this moment, George was still thinking about ending his current predicament with his own strength. However, when George returned home, he heard another piece of bad news. His pregnant wife suddenly went into labor. His father's symptoms suddenly worsened as well. To make matters worse, his wife was facing complications in childbirth, with a significant risk of both mother and child dying. Faced with this unexpected choice, George was completely at a loss. He could only return to the restaurant again and express his willingness to make a deal. The owner was very agreeable and served a plate of food, saying that after George ate it, he would need to kill his father instantly to ensure his wife's safety. George had no choice left. After finishing the meal, he rushed to the hospital and, suppressing his grief, poisoned his father to death. At that very moment, his wife's condition improved. In the end, both mother and child were safe. George felt a mix of emotions seeing his son. More than 10 years passed since then, and his son had grown into a young teenager. One day, he suddenly experienced a severe headache and claimed to see his deceased grandfather. Cursing George for his unfilial actions, he almost instantly understood that this was the restaurant owner reminding him. George immediately sought out the owner and, according to their agreement, killed the restaurant owner. In the next moment, all the green lights in the restaurant exploded, and the surroundings were plunged into darkness. Then George realized that the owner he had just killed had vanished. He recalled what the owner had said and hurriedly ran outside, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't leave this place. As time passed, he lost track of how many years had gone by. Now, George began to look for someone to take his place. Soon, the target presented itself willingly, and it was the mother of Brown, who had previously been silenced. She initially requested George to revive Brown, but Brown's soul had already been claimed by the demon, and George couldn't bring him back. Then the old woman proposed to regain her voice. For George, this was not a difficult task. Of course, in exchange, she would have to take his place. The old woman readily agreed. George quickly served a dish of chilled bitter melon leaves. After she consumed it, she indeed regained her ability to speak immediately. However, at this moment, she had a change of heart.
Tao muốn được tận mắt nhìn thấy mày chết, giống như cách con tao và các linh hồn tội nghiệp bước vô tiệm ăn của quỷ này.
At this moment, the unturned wooden wool suddenly began to spin on its own. Immediately after, the green lights in the restaurant suddenly exploded. In an instant, George experienced all the suffering that the souls had endured in life. He died on the spot. The old woman, who caused all these changes, became the new owner of the restaurant. The old woman wanted to escape the restaurant, but she could only wander here endlessly like George did. Back then, until the next successor appeared. The film ends here. Timon Kwakwi premiered this January. Although the film follows the conventional theme of a demonic deal, it combines with local Vietnamese folklore, making it appear quite novel. In addition, the horrifying foods featured in the film further enhance its originality. I highly recommend it to viewers who enjoy related themes to watch the original film. If you like my channel, please click to subscribe to it.